Greetings, intrepid listeners. Adorable, cuddly, humble, and fierce September 6er Paul Toscano generously agreed to team up with me to bring you a bumper Christmas hamper of brain food. On each of the 12 days of Christmas, Mormonism's little helpers will deliver to you a conversation about one of the big ideas or controversies in the theology of Mormonism. In my opinion, you are never stupid to have found the big ideas in this religion interesting, inspiring, and a launching point or guide by the side as you consider for yourself what on earth is the meaning and purpose of life, the universe, and everything. Is there a God? What kind of a person is a God? What does that God want from us or for us? Does Christianity or Mormonism have anything useful to say about this, or is it all a big distraction? Are their doctrines mind-expanding or thought-stopping? Since we can't get intellectually and spiritually fed on their starvation rations, we have to look elsewhere to have these conversations. And wonderfully, there have always been heroes like Paul Toscano willing to keep up the fight for making Mormonism much more interesting again, or Mamma Mia for short. Undaunted by betrayals, persecution, excommunication, and skepticism, he has fought the good fight, published the books, perambulated the podcasts, and kept fanning the flickering flame of hope that the better ideas in Joseph Smith's theology could make Christianity healthier and more rational, and that the Mormon religion could still stop ignoring or breaking the treasures it has inherited. It was a very rare privilege to chew on some of these big ideas with Paul and hear about some of his first-hand interactions and experiences trying to persuade the prophets and apostles of LDS Mormonism to raise their game. As always, Mormon civil war is not just about robust and valid critical analysis of why the church we love is spiraling down a plug hole towards oblivion, but also offering pathways out of that early grave. In these conversations, we grapple with the most fundamental concepts that would have to be resolved of all regarding things like the 5 or 6 different versions of the Godhead that LDS Mormonism has been running with, and what Jesus' atonement and grisly death was actually accomplishing. Brace yourselves. It's Christmas. I'm going to sing. On the 7th day of Christmas, Paul Toscano said to me, Joseph Smith, good or evil, mystics, prophets, and managers, scripture as visionary text. Revelation inside to theophany, imagination versus fantasy, idealism versus physicalism, and Mormonism versus Christianity. Welcome back, intrepid listeners. We're here with Paul Toscano talking about big, meaty doctrinal ideas in Mormonism. And our theme today is going to be a controversial one, which people have lots of very strong opinions about, which is Joseph Smith, good or evil? So let's get stuck in straight away. A lot rides on this one.
Yeah, I think this is probably the most historically centered of the subjects that we've taken up. And I'm not an historian. I'm a theologian, or as much of a theologian as you can be in Mormonism, where we don't have a school of theology and we tend to shy away from theology.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know whether I told you, did I ever tell you the story that I had about L. Tom Perry and my invitation to dinner at his house?
I think you mentioned an encounter with him in one of our earlier conversations.
I can't remember whether I can't remember what stories I tell. I think I may have, I was invited to dinner and I asked when he was a member of the 12 and I said, what do you guys talk about in the 12? And he said, well, they couldn't barely keep up with the agenda, never theology. So theology is not something
managers.
that even I remember that. Now I said it. But theology is not something that the leaders of the church like to talk about, and I don't think they like to talk about the history either, because it's all very difficult. And the question of whether Joseph Smith was good or evil is really problematical. In Joseph Smith's history, where he talks about his encounter with the angel Moroni just before the beginning of the revelations about the Book of Mormon, in verse 33, he's told by the angel that he would be known for good and evil, good or evil, throughout the world. And this is said to him on a number of occasions. And it turned out to be true. It has turned out to be true. He is condemned and mocked. Frankly, I think on slim or no evidence in some cases, but still he is condemned and mocked. And his ideas are rejected now by many Mormons and many former Mormons and many non-Mormons. So he is not held in very high repute by many people. What I want to say to you to begin with is, because I want to frame this discussion in a much larger frame. I want to remind your viewers that Joseph Smith was born in 1805. So he's born in the Regency period during the reign of George III, who reigned from 1760 to 1820. That's a long time.
You've already mentioned our king. It's interesting how internationally historians kind of follow the reigns of British kings sometimes to represent an era. So this is pre-Victorian. This is 1905. Was it 1805 when Napoleon properly got going with trying to take over the rest of Europe? So we're at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, this is really early on. This is very soon after the American Revolution.
Right. Joseph Smith was born very soon after the American Revolution, very soon after the Constitution was ratified. We're talking about 1789. Then, 14 years later, Joseph Smith is born. Maybe 16 years later, Joseph Smith is born. So he's born at the beginning of the Regency period, where you have George III dying in 1820. Then George IV reigns between 1820 and 1830. And then William IV reigns between 1830 and 1837. And then his niece, Victoria, ascends to the throne in 1837. And then that's a period where the great British legal reforms are taking place. So Joseph Smith dies at the beginning of the Victorian age.
And I think we often forget that's really early still,
very early.
It's
now what
it's
I want
a different world.
What I want to point out, and I'm going to do this in a rather circuitous way. I have my reasons for this, so bear with me, Peter.
I will.
There is a 2015 movie called Woman in Gold. And this is the story about a Jewish woman who escaped the Nazis in 1939 and wound up in Los Angeles. Her sister was there, and her sister had a son who was a young lawyer. I believe this is correct. Her family back in Germany in the 1930s was a very prominent, rich Jewish family living in Austria, in Vienna. And they had collected a lot of very valuable artwork. And one of the pieces that they had collected, that they owned, was Gustav Klimt's The Woman in Gold. And this was a beautiful portrait of her aunt, Adele, was the model for Klimt. And it was the famous Woman in Gold. And it was stolen by the Nazis. Now, this woman, whose name I can't remember, but it's played by Helen Mirren in the movie, and Ryan Reynolds plays her nephew, who's the lawyer. And the Helen Mirren character, I'll call her, is thinking about getting this Klimt painting back into her family because it was stolen by the Nazis and wound up in the hands of the Austrians. And she's trying to get this back. And so that's what the movie is about. And I'm not going to say anything more about the movie. It is a great movie, and people should go and watch it.
It's
What
a
I'm
great
going to
painting.
reference in this movie is a single scene, and it was the most heartbreaking scene I think I've ever seen in a movie. Because what happens is that in 1839, the Nazis are in Vienna, pounded on the door and got into this house. They're looting the house of all the valuable furniture and art. And the father and mother of this woman, who's the Helen Mirren character, when she's young, they realize it's over, that they should have left Austria much earlier, but they can't now get out. And so the young woman, their daughter, who's just gotten married, so their daughter and son-in-law are in the house on a pretext. They're going to go out and get some medication from an apothecary that the mother needs or the father needs. So there's just a quick trip to the apothecary, but really they know they're never going to come back. They can't show any emotion. They can't have any big farewells. Just, okay, we'll see you. And she goes in to see her parents sitting in two chairs facing her, and they look at each other and goodbye, and they go out the door. She goes out the door, and the movie follows her and her adventures in getting out of Germany. And that doesn't really go back to the parents. But in my mind, because I have daughters, I put myself, it's hard for me to talk about this, in the place of those parents. Their daughter they can't even hug her. She goes out the door and they know they will never see her again. But it's worse than that. They will never know whether she made it.
Yeah.
They will never know whether she made it to Switzerland or flying to England or getting to America. They never know whether her husband will have made it. They never know whether they had grandchildren. They live in terrible uncertainty. Now, the movie doesn't explore that aspect, but in my mind, that was what I recollected in my mind. And I just want to point out to everyone who's maybe watching this that the uncertainty is intolerable. It's one of the most intolerable experiences that people have. When you're waiting for somebody in the hospital, wondering whether they're going to get better, or you're old like I am and you're wondering whether you're going to wake up in the morning or be dead. The uncertainty is intolerable. And in the 19th century, we have to remember that people, even though they might have a lot of bravado and talk about their faith in Christ or their faith in God, or about their belief in the afterlife, underneath all of this bravado, there lurks serious uncertainty, because we don't know. And even when people get up and testify that they do know, we don't know. We have a lot of hope, and so this uncertainty is something that I want to point out, that in the 19th century, there were two ideas of certainty that were fighting. There was the religious idea of certainty, that there is a life after death, there is a heaven. And this is set forth in the Book of Mormon. The purpose of the Book of Mormon was to convince Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, that there is a resurrection, that there will be a life after death, that there will be an accounting. Ultimately, there will be justice. That's the message of the Book of Mormon. The very last verse is that I will farewell until I meet you before the pleading bar of the great Jehovah. That's the message of the Book of Mormon. 1829. 30 years later, there's another book published in 1859, Darwin's Origin of Species.
Origin of Species, yeah.
Which has a subtitle. It says, regarding the preservation of preferred races in the struggle for life. That's the subtitle. The preservation of preferred races in the struggle for life. His cousin was Francis Galton, who was the father of eugenics. And Origin of Species was used by the Nazis later as a validation for their killing off what they considered to be the inferior members of the human race, objectifying them and killing them. It's part of, survival of the fittest. And so you have in the 19th century, by the end of, you have two ways of resolving uncertainty. One is certainty in the hereafter and in Christ, and the other is certainty in oblivion, that this will end. All of our suffering will end in the grave, and we will be, go into an oubliette, and it's over.
And either you need to make the most of your life because you only live once, and or you can sacrifice other people because you sort of see your destiny as past setting up a legacy for future generations, which can be a powerful virtuous motivator. But if you value your worldview and culture and civilization or race over all else, and you just see yourself as a cog in a machine to help one group dominate, and that becomes your religion or your obsession, then even though in a sense you think knowing everyone only lives once should mean it doesn't matter, who cares what comes after me, you get this distorted sense of legacy of, right, well, let's kill all those people who might make life difficult for our species. And that really is a situation where a arguably scientific idea makes people evil and corrupts them, and they lose morality. I think that's a really good point to make, that, if you don't mind me interrupting, that we're so used to science being virtuous and about truth, and particularly in the post-Mormon conversations where you can't even talk about evolution in gospel doctrine still, and you've got people there who think there was a global flood 6,000 years ago, and we haven't even had that 1800s conversation as a religion theologically that the rest of Christianity has at least grappled with. So it tends to be that post-Mormons or nuanced Mormons we're mostly defending science. We spend most of our time defending evidence, science, Darwinism, evolution, whatever, as real. Therefore, get with the program and stop believing so many superstitious fairy tales about our existence and the creation. But I think it is important to remember that can go another way as well. You still need basic ethics and compassion. Otherwise, that can, and we've seen, the lesson of history is the Nazis weren't the first to do genocide. It becomes a bloodthirsty nightmare. And the Book of Mormon actually has a very strong narrative around that an entire civilization is lost in slaughter twice with the Jaredites and then the Nephites, by making that their priority to war and conquest, and become nihilistic and just not care anymore if they live or die. And somehow they've lost connection to divinity or humanity, whichever you want to call it, or both. Yes, I'm feeling what you're saying, Paul. Yeah.
There's a little more that I want to say about this that goes right along with what you're saying.
Yeah.
So these two ideas, I talked about them in terms of trying to get out of uncertainty and achieve certainty, either certainty of the religious nature or certainty of the non-religious nature, either heaven or oblivion, right? Either heaven or hell or oblivion. But there's another way to look at it, and that is in the religious concept, in the Christian concept, you have a top-down creation. Creation is coming from the top down. In the Darwinian concept, it's bottom up. It's things are percolating. Life is percolating up. You go from, amazingly, from inorganic matter to organic matter, and then from organic matter to living matter, and then you go to more complex matter, running up against the second law of thermodynamics somehow, and we wind up where we are. And it's full of mystery, and it's full of gaps, as is the other version of creation coming down. So you have these two competing ideas of creation going on. And you also have, curiously, as you pointed out, you hinted at it in what you just said, you have in the Book of Mormon a story that begins with a city in desolation, because Jerusalem is about ready to be invaded by the Babylonians. And so the warning of Lehi is you've got to get out. So you have a desolate. You start in desolation, you end in desolation. But the story of Joseph Smith is similar. He start his life. I mean, in a way, mythically, The Bible starts in a garden
Mm.
and of peace and love, and ends with the New Jerusalem, a city of peace and love. So you start with a garden, and you a holy in holiness, and you end in holiness. That's the narrative arc of the Bible. The Book of Mormon has the opposite narrative arc.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah,
And the
of course.
Joseph Smith's life is
Wow.
simultaneously both,
Mm.
because he starts with the first vision, which is like the Garden of Eden. In fact, Jesus
Mm.
arrives there, and there's the Satan appears. He has to be cast out by
Mm.
Michael, and it's like
Mm.
he's in the garden again. And it
Yeah.
ends in with the temple ceremonies in Nauvoo, which is a kind of ritualization of the Garden of Eden
Mm.
story and Joseph Smith's
Mm.
own first vision.
Mm.
And so I sometimes think that Joseph Smith's first vision was an endowment ceremony where he was given the
Mm.
fullness of the priesthood, and then in the end of his life he's trying to give this to other people through the
Mm.
ritual of the endowment, the temple ceremony.
And that is a theme that a lot of general authorities over the years, and probably Hugh Nibley and other people, have definitely picked up on. I don't know. I'm sure Joseph Smith talked about such things, if I remember correctly. But this idea that all these sort of encounters with the divine, oh, it's an endowment. It crops up like back in the day in doing Institute with the Old Testament. It's like, oh yeah, so Moses goes up the mountain, meets God, endowment. The transfiguration for Peter, James, and John, that was their endowment. Jethro, some and random, anything to do with Enoch and so on. So, however you want to interpret endowment, it is these kind of epiphanies, these encounters, these moments where, as described somewhat in the Bible, but definitely really elaborated upon in Moses and Abraham in Joseph Smith's Pearl of Great Price, the idea of being shown everything. Enoch's shown everything.
Mm-hmm.
Moses is shown everything. Your place in history, your role in the world, and that's kind of what the endowment is. It tells us the big sweep of history and where you are in it. Why do we exist? Why are there animals in the world? What's our future, and what do you do about it all? One of my first forays into Bloganacle was being invited by Rational Faith blog, and one of the articles I wrote for that was kind of my feelings about the temple and the endowment, and kind of a love-hate relationship with it all. And a point I was making there was actually, because at the time I was really quite involved in teaching religious education in our school and looking at what are the commonalities globally, and all tribal animist religion involves taking your young people, putting them into a sacred space away from normal life, and teaching them this, telling them about the dream time, telling them about the legends and the culture and the religion of your tribe, where everything came from, why are there men and women, why do we hunt, what do you have to do to be a good adult in our society, and the big picture. And then you get inducted into that with lots of rituals, maybe some suffering and pain and so on, and then released back into the tribe, and you're now considered ready to be a mature adult. And it was kind of a really powerful epiphany for me to realize that the endowment is tapping into that absolutely most fundamentally basic religious tradition that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years in human history, as far as we can tell. And there's something really primitive and beautiful and amazing. And of course, that it should be experienced as an immersive drama, as you've mentioned before, not bored to death by PowerPoint. Meant to be experienced as something you participate in with live actors who taking on these roles, which is what animist tribes have always done. So yeah, I love that you're picking up on these big picture stuff, this deep rooted connection to God in things that we often don't think about that deeply,
Well,
or
let
can
me
be
let
really
me add
skeptical about. Yeah, go
one
on.
more thing to what you're saying,
Mm.
and that is that what's peculiar about Joseph Smith's experience, and what I think it becomes a pattern for maybe us even, I don't know,
Mm.
is that even though in one sense he goes from a first vision garden to temple ceremony or the Nauvoo period, where it's an attempt at a holy city, although it doesn't work. Simultaneously, he starts in desolation and he ends in desolation in Carthage. So it is both a U-shaped program going from, down and then back up, like the Bible starts in a holy garden and ends in a holy city. At the same time, Joseph Smith starts in desolation. His parents are in a terrible state of poverty after their, I don't know what that investment that Joseph Smith Sr. made, I think in ginseng.
Ginseng, yes, yeah. Silly man.
Right. And then they're in poverty and have to keep moving around. And then, of course, the death of his brother Alvin and Joseph Smith's own surgery on his leg. And then the attempt to make money by treasure digging, looking for Captain Kidd's treasure, whatever they were trying to do. And then you have this first vision, which seems to take them back up to something. And then immediately after, it collapses back. I mean, the church, the experience between the church, the first vision and his death in 1844 is pockmarked with tragedy. I mean, one damn thing after another. I mean, you have the Kirtland Bank, you have the polygamy problem being tarred and feathers. One of the twins dies, or maybe both, I can't remember. He has children that die. And he sees terrible things. And it's like the Bible. You start in the Garden of Eden, you get expelled, and then you have the whole book showing you all the horrible things that can happen, including the crucifixion of God. What's going on here? We have to look at these big patterns, as you say. And I think that in order to answer the question of whether Joseph Smith was good or bad, I think you have to see his life within this larger context. And you have to ask yourself the question, do we know his motivations for what he did? Can we know them without cross-examining him? Can we know what his intent was, regardless of how it looks? And I, frankly, I was a lawyer for many years, and I litigated, and I came to understand that unless people are deposed and cross-examined, you really don't know what's going on. There's plausibility, but you're sometimes surprised that what you thought was plausible and likely turns out not to be true. And so you have to see, not only do you have to see what Joseph Smith was doing, there's an element of desperation in what he's doing, because he's supposed to organize Zion and all of this in preparation for the second coming, or the time of tribulations and all of that. Well, it's interesting that there's another book that you've got, the Book of Mormon in 1829, and you've got the Origin of Species in 1859. But there was another book that was published in 1819, about that time, when Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Now, this book had was not at all popular or well read during the 19th century, but it got a lot of currency in the 20th century, because I've tried to read it. It's almost impenetrable in its prose, but you can read it, and it is a warning against this idea of bottom-up creation. That is the idea that, if we think we can create heaven on earth, or we think we can create paradise on earth, it's going to backfire on us, and that's the big message. Well, that has truly turned out to be quite a prophetic book. But so is the Book of Mormon prophetic, because it starts in desolation and ends in desolation, in spite of the fact that right at the center of it is the Christian resurrection. It doesn't eliminate. We have to think about that. It's like the war in heaven. What the hell is the war? Why is there war in heaven? And so I think that if you're going to ask the question is, what was Joseph Smith's anxiety? What were his hopes and fears? What were his doubts? You have to
because he definitely went through manic periods. some people analyze him as, you know, he definitely had sort of manic depressive phases, had periods of intense activity and energy, and others where he was just withdrawing and very down. And you know, people who knew him described that at times. And a lot
This
of great
manic
people are like
depression
that.
is what I want to
Yeah.
talk about.
Okay.
You're right at the point
Yeah.
where I want to
Yeah.
bring this up, because I want to
Yeah.
use an
Mm,
example of myself that came
mm,
up when you were last interviewing me in the last
mm.
2 episodes.
Yes.
Something happened that
Mm,
made me realize that I could use it as an example of
mm,
this problem that we have with Joseph Smith, and it was with me.
mm, mm,
Because what happened was that I was explaining to you what happened on September the 12th, 1993, when I woke up and had a
mm,
presentment in a dream. And
mm,
it seemed to be encouraged to do a ritual, I said,
mm,
on the next week. When I was told I would be excommunicated, I got up in the morning and
mhm,
performed this ritual. That's what I said, this ritual.
mm,
And I left
mm.
it there. And then
Mm.
later you cross-examined me because you were thinking, what the hell does he mean by did he kill a
Yeah.
chicken? What did he do? What does he mean? And then I realized I was being vague. And I said, well, okay,
Mm,
the ritual really was the sacrament, the ordinance of the sacrament, and the ordinance
mm,
called the second anointing. And
mm,
then since you talked to me about, since you cross-examined me, and I
mm.
kind of admitted, what the real ordinances were, and it wasn't killing a chicken or anything,
Yeah.
uh,
I
you
suggested human.
or human
I
sacrifice, which
I went
was
large. It
I
was in case it was a chicken, it wouldn't sound so bad. I was
yeah,
just
yeah, but a
I was
human. It wasn't a human. It wasn't a chicken. It was just something that we know about.
Yeah.
And I asked myself, why was I vague? And then when I
Yeah.
finally told you, I justified it in 3 ways. I justified it by the dream I had. I justified it by a statement from the temple ceremony that says, with the robe on
Mm,
the right shoulder, you can
mm,
you can perform any of the ordinances of the Melchizedek priesthood. And then I
mm,
quoted to you section 77, verse 11, that says that,
mm,
this ordinance can be done by the angels or by others, right? And
mm,
so I justified it. Said, why did I try to hide it? And
mm,
why did I, after I told it to you, why did I justify it?
mm,
And I realized why. Because I'm ashamed,
mm,
because it's embarrassing. Because I realized that when I told this story, that people who were true believing Mormons will see this as a confession of my insubordination and my apostasy and my
mm,
willingness to do things without permission of the apostles. And they
mm.
would say, well,
Yeah.
this justifies your excommunication. On
Mm,
the other hand, you know, former Mormons are going to say it's just a psychological defense mechanism that I came
mm,
up with to deal with this
mm,
trauma of being
mm,
excommunicated.
mm,
And so it's just a psychological, it's some
mm,
projection or something,
mm.
it's one of these many
And in a way, for
defense
me,
mechanism.
and
And
my
let me,
analysis
Peter, let
immediately
me,
was in a way it was political. It was like a statement of rebellion. You know, that was my first thought as well. In a way, it was a political act. It was saying you can't control me. I have autonomy over my religious life, and
right.
and just as much as you do. And it was a statement of empowering yourself in a very disempowering situation. So as you say, there's lots of angles to it, always to
And then
interpret what happened.
there's the other angle, which is that people will say, well, this is what a person does when they've been marinated in a cult for 30 years. So,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of ways, and all of which are shameful,
Yeah.
and none
I
of
wouldn't
which,
say they're shameful.
and I think they're reasonable. I mean, all of
Mm,
these interpretations,
mm,
I'd have to say, are reasonable interpretations. And
mm,
in my lowest periods, I think, well, maybe they're right. But
mm,
the problem with that is that they don't capture how I feel. And
mm,
how I feel is probably the most difficult thing to tell you, which
mm.
I'm going to try to do briefly.
Yeah.
And that is, I don't like, I feel bad about talking about it, and I feel bad about justifying it, what I did, what we did, really. And because because how shall I put this? It's so difficult to put it. I start, when I start thinking that it was the right thing to do, immediately I start to doubt that. Almost immediately, I start doubting it. And as soon as I start doubting it, I start doubting my doubts. And as soon as I start thinking about it, I get into the syndrome where I'm doubting my belief, and then I doubt my doubts, and then I don't know how to explain it. And I start oscillating because I think to myself, well, I know that God's love is unconditional, so why should I doubt it? But then again, why should I get a blessing? Other people maybe not get the blessing, and so I doubt. I'm just making this up because I want to feel good about myself. So I go through this manic, depressive syndrome, and I realize that the only way I can get out of it is to not think about it, to step away from it entirely. And so because I end up either being vague about it or forgetting, not wanting to think about it, except that I feel that when I talk about my excommunication, I have a kind of a duty to try to be transparent about what actually happened and what happened to me. But as soon as I start talking about it, I get into the syndrome of doubt on the one hand, and faith, and it's almost like arrogance and despair. It's going between arrogance and despair. It's a nightmare. And so
where that's coming from is our conditioning. It's to be it's not your place to take control of an ordinance. How dare you? It's the priesthood key holders who you have to go and grovel to and pay 10% of your income and pass an interview, and then they administer it. You don't administer that yourself. And you wait to be called to the royalty and not initiated into their oligarchy. And so that, you shouldn't be, in my opinion, you shouldn't be ashamed at all whatsoever of any of that. Of course, you do what you need to do, express religion how feels right for you at the time.
but I
And
wonder if
and it,
Joseph Smith, if
mm,
we could depose him, if he didn't feel the same.
yeah.
I just wonder if,
Mm,
he didn't, he went from arrogance to despair, when he went from faith
mm,
to doubt, when he went from
mm,
the
mm,
bright side to the dark side, going back and
mm,
forth. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that unless we have a chance to cross-examine him, I mean, let's
mm,
say about polygamy, I mean, maybe he felt
mm,
like he had to, this was in the time of the great reformers on marriage,
mm,
Oneida and the Shakers, and
yeah.
Lord Byron and the
Mm,
Shelley and the rest of them in England. People were re-examining marriage, and he maybe saw himself as a reformer. And
mm,
but then you have doubts because you think anything you do that's sexual, you feel like it's all for you, because
mm,
we're we've he was slightly pre-Victorian, but I think it was in the air in his lifetime, and
mm,
people,
mm,
Puritanism certainly was in the air at the time. And
mm,
so maybe if you would have asked him, don't you feel bad about asking these women, some quite young, to marry you? And if we could cross-examine him, he said, yeah, if I were to do, I wouldn't do it if I could do it
mm,
again. I'm sorry I brought it up, because the
mm,
idea was I was trying to reform marriage. I was trying to find out a way that
mm,
which adults could have sex with more than one adult, but
mm,
still take care of all the children, and have this
mm,
law of consecration, which would be a way of supporting everybody. I thought this was a great idea, but I didn't count on it.
mm, mm,
Human in nature, I mean, he could have maybe had that. On the other
mm,
hand, we might find out that we would be very disappointed in him. We
mm,
could find out that maybe he wasn't the character that we want him to be. But I don't
mm,
think we can know that by looking at historical documents and looking at
mm,
testimonies that were given years later. That I don't think we can have certainty about that. And so my feeling is, was Joseph Smith
mm,
good or evil? I don't think we can know, but we can know that he is known for good and evil,
mm.
and that was prophesied from the very beginning. In his first tellings, the angel Moroni told him that he would be known for good or evil in verse 33 of his history. And so I don't know how to answer that question.
Mm. Can I make some suggestions? So I love everything you've said there. That's a lot of food for thought, and I've been writing down a few sort of points to kind of go back and revisit, if that's okay with you, and
Oh,
maybe
sure.
make an attempt at answering that question. Um, I think first of all, in a way, what you said about the uncertainty being so painful, I think it's not just our uncertainty of whether how we judge, did Jesus really exist? Was he just a carpenter? Did he actually say what Paul decided he meant he was saying later? You can't ever go and prove that. The uncertainty of when someone is committing is accused of a crime and the evidence against them is a bit shaky, that can be agonizing. You know, we have a case here of a nurse who killed loads of babies was accused of it, but at the same time, there are experts coming through saying it could be a massive miscarriage of justice. And we all know situations where there've been miscarriages of justice, you know, people convicted of being Irish terrorists and bombing things and they didn't, you know, that has been quite intense in the psyche of the British polity, that we know there have been some huge injustices because there was a social momentum to go a certain way and to judge people a certain way. But actually, people were lying and fabricated evidence or just wanted a conviction. And you know, often it's very clear if someone's a school shooter and you got them on camera, you know who did what, but other situations where you just can't know. And it is agonizing. It's so frustrating. And people interpreting history have to grapple with this all the time. You know, we've got who murdered the princes in the tower has been a centuries old dilemma that Shakespeare explored in his plays and all the rest of it. And I haven't had time to read it, but the news headlines here for the last few weeks have been, oh, we've actually worked out the solution. I'm like, how would you even do that? So I'm looking forward to reading that. But psychologically, it's been an open wound
Right.
because we hate a mystery. This thing happens like in the Middle Ages, but no one has let it go. The two heirs to the throne just disappeared, and all kinds of possibilities. And it's like, who was Jack the Ripper is another one
Oh,
in
who
British
killed
culture.
Kennedy?
Who killed Kennedy? You know, it traumatizes a whole nation not to have these answers, and certainly when you're basing your whole religion on things that you are uncertain, and there's these different opinions about the person, including Jesus, you know, the person we're all meant to believe in as our savior, and your founder prophets. But I think the problem, in a sense, we face, also the positive opportunity, is the fact that our religion started within modern history that was very thoroughly documented. I've got, you know, occasionally I've forayed into eBay and I've got very early 1930s and 40s newspapers with little articles about the nascent Mormon community. And I mean, it's incredible. You know, this was a literate society. And yes, he was causing a stir from very early on. And people were all gossiping about it in the newspapers because that was their internet. So you get amazing sort of detail of what people were saying in contemporary records. So that maybe you could argue that gives us the illusion of certainty about some things where, and the major effort of a lot of the apologists is, well, we don't know enough, therefore give him the benefit of the doubt. You know, give brother Joseph a break, as Quentin Cook says. Or, you know, to you can't prove that he was a sexual predator of teenagers and all that in as a defense. I would suggest, though, I just want to talk about three-ish categories. So you've mentioned, how can we know his motivations? Is it Joseph's fault? And um, does whether Joseph was good or evil even matter? And a few things around that, because you've really hit on some big stuff here. And so if you don't mind bearing with me, I'll try and be as quick as possible
No, no, go
in
ahead.
my thoughts on what you were saying there. So first of all, does it matter if Joseph was good or evil? I think it does profoundly, because obviously you want to be part of a sincere enterprise. If it's saying it's a matter of integrity, and this is what it always boils down to, it seems for me, with most of the people who leave the church, not because they want to do cannabis and drink tea, but they've actually thought about it, which is a lot of people. Um, if we're engaged in this enterprise, particularly in its perhaps self-defeating absolutist rhetoric, that you have to be worthy of blessings, that blessings are predicated upon obedience to laws, that transactional religion you've talked a lot about in our discussion so far, which is sort of the Pharisee approach in my language. The um, the the idea that you will be judged regularly in worthiness interviews and given massive guilt trips from age 11 about anything. Are you honest in all your dealings? Are you mostly they try and make it sexual? Are you living the law of chastity? Did you look at a catalogue last week? Are you masturbating, which all teenagers do, or the vast majority? Are you doing this, that, and the other? Are you having bad thoughts? At the same time, though, keeping it so vague, the uncertainty, never explaining clearly and consistently enough to young people what your expectations even are, and abdicating responsibility to do that by just saying, well, God will tell me if you're worthy. I'm going to ask you some intrusive questions that may be completely different to what another bishop will ask you. And God will tell me by the Holy Spirit, because I have the keys of judgment as your bishop and a judge in Israel, whether or not you're worthy of blah, 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 a temple recommend, a calling, being able to leave this room without feeling terribly guilty about yourself. And so you kind of, it's all woo, it's all mystery, it's all, well, God told me this, God told me that. And it can be used as a control mechanism so easily. I had the first time that my temple recommend was ever not granted was a couple of years before my excommunication, when I was having my interview with the stake president. It was in my early days of becoming a bit more rebellious, and the gospel topics essays were out. And he asked me, do I sustain the leaders? And I said, yes, as long as they're telling the truth and they're sustainable, as long as they're being honest and when they're speaking for God. And to give an example, the gospel topics essays have come out and confirmed that the racist segregation in the church was not of God, that God would never do that. The first and last paragraphs of the gospel topics essay just adamant, they're sweeping generalizations. God would never do this. But then there's all the nuancing up in the middle and trying to blame society and Brigham Young. And he said, well, I'm not sure they say that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you've not read it, have you? Well, you've gaslit yourself for reading it, something. And he basically he wouldn't take that as an example of the leaders being wrong, in effect. So he was going with the leaders are infallible and you can't ever say otherwise, or you're not having a temple recommend. So he didn't grant me my temple recommend, and he said, I need to think about this, and then sat on it for 3 months. And as usual in these situations, he will have either realized he's totally wrong, or it's raised a faith crisis for him. This gets talked about regularly with stake presidents and bishops who go away and think about what a nuanced member said to them, and then their answer will be some cure. So he just said, the Lord needs you in the temple, and handed me the signed, temple recommend. And it's so patronizing. It's like, yeah, so you're totally avoiding discussing the issue I raised then, aren't you? You're just keeping it vague. And that vagary, I think, is something I'm noticing more and more as a tactic, and that uncertainty used as a negative, whereas you talked about the uncertainties of quantum physics opening up all kinds of amazing, wonderful, mind-expanding, visionary possibilities, and also giving up the evil shibboleth of certainty that makes people fundamentalist and then cruel to other people in ignorance, rather than having the humility to realize we've still got a lot to learn. But in that sense, the vagueness and uncertainty is used as a defense mechanism for abuse of power, that you don't actually have to be held accountable for anything because it's all vague, it's all uncertain, or I felt this way. Is it Joseph's fault? One of my and I'm glad you're kind of reminding me of this, because the narrative mostly you'll hear in post-Mormon dialogue is visceral rage. And I was at Thrive UK recently and just talking to people who, like me and you, spent decades sacrificing everything for this religion, harming friendships and family relationships to prioritize the church over them, giving up so much of our money and time on things that proved to be futile or lies. Absolute visceral anger
Yes,
about that.
yes.
And so they should. I'm still angry. I say
I
regularly, I'm incandescent with rage. Nemo is He's not angry, he's disappointed. I am viscerally rageful at the awfulness of it. But in Joseph Smith's defense, the rage being he was a con man, he played everyone, he was a conniving manipulator, he clearly had amazing Darren Brown-like magician social skills to make people think they're seeing visions when they're not. And you can when you have that lens, you can kind of see it in the documentary evidence. And definitely a dangerous sexual predator who was a threat to anyone's daughters. But my sort of defense for him is, if it's real, it's God's bloody fault. It's not Joseph's fault. God said to some poor teenager in a pre-Victorian, early Napoleonic worldview, in a primitive country, clearing the forests and building stuff. Yes, they were next to the Erie Canal, the information superhighway of the age. So he wasn't in the forest fighting bears. He was
Hmm.
near advanced modern civilization, but still his lifestyle was abject poverty and grinding, no banks, try the complication of just existing in that kind of an economy as a poor farmer. And he was told, age 14, you are not to join any of these other churches, but you are going to be a prophet. Interestingly, he's never told he was going to be a prophet in that vision, just not to join the other ones. People project that onto that moment. I've never seen an account of the first vision that said he was called to be a prophet. We've made that up later, if that was true. But then giving him so little information to go on. I've tried reading Rough Stone Rolling, and it's painfully dry because it is very academic, and I got about a third way through. But the major message I got from getting that far was he was so tentative at every step. His early revelations were not that earth-shattering. They were kind of riffing a bit on passages from Isaiah or whatever. He really didn't know what was going to happen next. He constantly led an extremely uncertain life, as you just described, with
Hmm.
so much tragedy and hardship and pain and difficulty. He didn't, we all have hindsight. He was really, even if it was a corrupt effort, he was winging it every day. And what an amazingly successful con man to keep scaling up. Did he ever really intend to start a religion? One of the skeptical conversations is, was he writing the Book of Mormon just to sell books and make a bit of money that way? In which case, why all this effort and why is it so complex and deep?
Hmm.
I mean, but we don't know the uncertainty. Can we know? But Howard's telling a young man, you're a prophet and I'm giving you revelations and here's a book of scripture, go ahead, but restore Christianity, not totally mess someone's head up. I mean, of course he became prideful and overclaiming and arrogant and tormented and making silly mistakes. And how would you ever discern, as such a young person, even in his 20s, the difference between his own urges and impulses and a revelation from God?
Yeah.
Especially if the angels aren't visiting every week. He's having a few epiphanies and encounters with the divine. But how can we judge his motivations? In that sense, it's always going to be a mess. There's no way of coming out of that
Well,
not
my
really
question, my
screwed up.
question to you is, how could it be
Yeah,
otherwise?
yeah, exactly. I agree.
Why that
Um,
the
yeah.
opening line of the hymn we
Mm,
now sing, and I'm surprised we sing it, "Amazing Grace,
mm,
how sweet the sound
mm,
that saved a wretch like me." I mean,
yeah.
what we have now is this ridiculous thing where we think Russell M. Nelson is perfect, and
Mm.
before him, Thomas
They
Monson was
were all
perfect,
perfect.
and they're all
Yeah.
perfect, and they all go back to Brigham Young, who was
Mm,
perfect, and then you get to Joseph Smith, who was a scoundrel,
yeah.
and then we
I think
have to
most people
cover
would
up.
have Brigham Young on the scoundrel list, but yes.
Yeah, and Brigham
Yeah.
Young was a scoundrel, and they're all perfect, but not
Mm,
Joseph Smith,
mm,
and we don't want to talk about
mm,
him because
mm,
he's. But what if they're all scoundrels?
mm,
What if we're
yeah.
all scoundrels? What
Hmm.
if it's always
Yeah.
the word of, where God works through earthen vessels, somewhere it says,
Mm,
I
yeah.
mean, like you're saying, a teenage boy growing up, and he confesses that he sinned, and when he went back and prayed, he was looking for the Lord's forgiveness, and then the angel appears and tells him about the book, but that he would be known for good and evil. But none of the leaders of the church, I mean, Russell M. Nelson has never stood up before the conference and gave a speech saying, when I was young and masturbated, when I had lust for one of my nurses. No, I'm making this up because I don't know if that ever happened. But I mean, let's suppose he said that I did things because I was attracted to women that right now I'm ashamed of and I wouldn't do. Or maybe those that when the what you guys called it that group that you call the it's like Brexit, but I can't think of the name that you call yourselves the
Brit Vengers.
The Brit Vengers, yeah. When that came up, when you had those apostles come and allegedly come to answer questions, and they just do what they normally do, which is evade questions. And then they talked about, made indirect references to the second anointing, and they made it. So just trust us because we've made it.
Yeah.
Well, the way I look at the second anointing is that you're dedicating yourself to a life of anonymity and loss, giving up for the sake of those who have even less, because that's the model that Jesus did, the Via Dolorosa, not the Via Curiosa. And so you have but they're not doing that. So you have to disengage the church, the LDS Church, from the mystical tradition in which Joseph Smith is no longer seen. My wife, who is an expert in Western mysticism of the Christian religion, and then others too, of Jewish too, and she says that Joseph Smith fits as he's more of a mystic than a prophet. But like, if you look at the lives of the mystics, they're not lives that you would necessarily see as ideal, or you wouldn't want to model yourself after them, because a lot of them make terrible mistakes, are kind of selfish, somewhat egotistical. They, Marjorie Kemp is famous for this, and Mechtilde of Magdeburg is different, and Hildegard von Bingen is different, and they all have different problems. Meister Eckhart had different problems. Aquinas says, one of them said, I think it was Augustine, who said, help me to be chaste, but not yet. I mean, they're bargaining with God, and sex is one of the biggest problems, because it's, no matter what we say about it, no matter how many encomiums we make about this, the fact is that it makes us feel selfish, and we can't deal with that, and so Joseph Smith, having no guidance, and he had an alcoholic father and a mother who might have been a little bit puritanical in her points of view. Maybe you don't have anybody to talk to about these things except other guys in the locker room, and they're really not very helpful. And you don't get the guidance from angels that people attribute to you. Like you said, you have to work it out, and you're in at the beginning of the Victorian period, at the end of the Regency period, and you got Jane Austen writing at the early part of the 19th century, and then you've got other things going on. By the end of the 19th century, people are throwing the whole religion thing out the window in favor of a Darwinian bottom-up concept. So yes, you're absolutely right. And added to this is the problem that we don't understand mysticism. We don't understand how Joseph Smith fits into the mystical tradition, and we are guilty of presentism. We take our present views of morality, our present sensitivities, our present taboos. I'm surprised we haven't condemned Joseph Smith for, promoting gluten or something. I mean, we take these ideas that we have today and we kind of impose them on a person who was living at the early part of the 19th century. It seems a little unfair, and yet I understand the idea that he may have been a con man. I mean,
he was. It's undoubted. He was. That was his skill set. The best redemption story you could put on it is God saving a con man and turning him, Les Miserables, turning him into a virtue, to use his skills for good, maybe. But then how many cons carried on happening, lying about the origins of the Book of Abraham and things like that. I'm going to push back a bit now because there'll be a lot of post-Mormons screaming at at the screen. So I'm going to be your voice for them. But yeah, I mean, you've absolutely reminded me and convinced me that yes, there's certainly um, so it is important not to be too presentist. However, a couple of counter arguments to that. One is it wasn't that long ago. We've already talked about, yes, it was long ago, but
Mhm.
it was totally illegal to do polygamy in his day. He was growing up in a Christian environment that was against adultery. The people doing the experiments were a tiny minority of extreme nut jobs who he may or may not have even heard of much until he got going, and a few of them joined his movement. He had every opportunity to be ethical and moral. The law intervenes. He was probably convicted of deceiving poor treasure diggers and for his antisocial behavior. But as you say, a lot of the great innovative thinkers and mystics have been, by definition, outside of mainstream society. They've been what we'd call nicely in England the eccentrics. They've been the
Mhm.
eccentric people who don't fit the mold, who try and do something different, who aren't just going to follow the herd and think and live like everyone else, who are ambitious for better. And he knew what abject poverty was like, and good on him trying to find a way out. I often think the irony is, if he'd just been a bloody novelist, he'd have been great. He could have been the next Robert Louis Stevenson. If he slightly worked on his literary skills, he could have literally had a much happier life and made as much money ultimately, because he didn't get that rich, by just publishing novels from all these great stories he told about the ancient Americans growing up. He could have been done the Lord of his Rings of his age, or something a bit more pulp fiction, but it would have sold like Topsy. He this sort of this terrible strategic error of trying to make a religion out of the book he wrote, or whoever wrote it. It's almost like, mate, this could have been a lot easier for you. So why was he so driven to be religious is one of these great questions. Um, but I think also Jesus did give us a way to make judgments about someone and maybe their life or their contribution to society, and that is, by their fruits ye shall know them. And if the fruits of what Joseph Smith started is a religion that rapidly descended into Pharisaical corrupt control, and you could argue all religions do that anyway, however nice the founder is, but
Mhm.
that's still a fruit. We were meant to not go the same way. The whole narrative was meant to be, we won't make the same mistakes being corrupted by sex and money like the Catholics were. That's what we all grew up on, the great apostasy. We won't make up and invent scripture.
Yeah.
We won't lie to our people. And the history of the church, including in Joseph Smith's time, is riddled with all of that stuff. So I think in that sense, it's it's a no-brainer. Yes, you can absolutely judge Joseph Smith. He was a sexual predator, a con man. He established an organization that has harmed far more than it's helped, that far more people have chosen to leave it than stay in it, by roughly 80%, and that this is not a success story. It's a bad idea that just keeps trundling on because it's got enough attempts at virtuous Christianity going on amongst grassroots members, but they're so bamboozled they don't realize they're being played and the extent that they are. And maybe they could play out their instincts for morality better somewhere else. And ultimately, since we're not even baptizing middle class nuclear families anymore, the only people it's helping are those who would be even worse off without it. Yes, being a Mormon, even if you think it's a terrible cult, and most post Mormons agree, is better than being a drug addict and dying. Yes, it is better than being friendless and lonely in the world, and 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 miserable. Yes, it is better than having no functional, kind people in your life because your whole family is dysfunctional. And these are the people that mostly are being converted by the missionaries now in the developed world. Is the extremely vulnerable, the migrants, the disconnected, the lonely, and the troubled, who need something better, and the church is a step up. But for me, the big disaster has been not also working just as assertively on the rest of it, in a religion where you're meant to learn your way to becoming God, to become so anti-knowledge, anti-research, anti-education, anti-philosophy, anti-learning in any kind. and to demonize being too clever or too, whatever, intellectual, is disastrous. Because for a start, you alienate all the people who can provide the support and the wealth and stability for the people who are very much in need. So you're breaking off half of the dynamic that needs to be in place for a thriving church community. And it's just ludicrous because it's incompatible with the core beliefs. So what do we do when judging Joseph Smith? I think, in a sense, what you've been pointing at all along is, unfortunately, you have to jettison trusting the church. You have to jettison a huge percentage of the culture. You even have to jettison a lot of what Joseph Smith himself taught. We have to, in effect, construct our own religion. Look around there for the good bits, hold on to them, and reject the rest. But then you can come full circle. Where do we read that? Oh, the scriptures. Hold fast to that which is good. So test all
But there's
things.
more than that. I mean, there's the whole
And
pattern of the
yeah,
Book of Mormon. It
mm,
starts in desolation, it ends in desolation. That's how
mm,
your whole life has been, Peter. It starts in religious desolation and ends in
yeah,
desolation. But
yeah,
out of that, there's a phoenix that rises out
mm,
of that. And
yeah,
Joseph Smith's life starts in desolation and ends in
mm,
desolation. We don't, even though we want to believe that we
mm,
start in a garden and will end in a holy city, that's not what happens. Something else
mm,
happens.
yeah,
And in the Book of Mormon, it says, "Why have you polluted the holy church of God?" In Mormon 8,
mm,
you have that.
mm,
I mean, when Joseph Smith is allegedly writing this or translating it or channeling it or however the Book of Mormon copying it,
mm,
you get to Mormon chapter 8, the Book of Mormon within the Book of Mormon, chapter 8. It says, "Why have you polluted the holy church of God?" And who
mm,
polluted it? Was it Joseph Smith? Was it Brigham
mm,
Young? Is it Russell
mm,
M. Nelson? Is it the members who polluted? Frankly, he, I, it, it, it's like there was an old comic strip called Pogo, and in it, the hero Pogo says, "I have met the enemy, and it is us." And
mm,
in a sense,
mm,
it is we who want perfection.
mm,
We want our leaders to be perfect, and they
mm,
want us to be perfect. And
mm,
we want certainty, and they want certainty, and we want to
mm,
be the one and only true, whatever it is, and they want to be
mm,
the one and only true. And all of this is just
mm.
pollution that
So
somehow we
what?
have to we have
Yeah.
to recognize that, yes, Joseph Smith may have been both good and bad, and probably was both good and bad,
Mm.
and we have the job of doing whatever, of picking the good out of the bad, and that's what we always have to do.
And that's my sort of in overall solution. That's where I've arrived at with my podcasting journey and exploring all of this. And it's been a surprise. Is I mean, so the fundamental error here is Joseph Smith could be a fantastic role model, whatever bad we find out about him, if you allow him to be imperfect. If you stop
Yes.
this idiotic Mormon culture thing of over perfecting everything and claiming, and which suits the leading oligarchy, obviously, to kind of be themselves in that mold. Something I've obsessed about in my podcast is that in the year I started seminary, in the church history year in 1985, I think it was, or six, at the training symposium at Brigham Young University for all the CES staff, Dallin Oakes and Russell Nelson, who are still bloody there in charge of everything, gave keynote addresses, reading church history, and whatever one Nelson's was called, I think it was Oakes was called Reading Church History, but they both made the same point, which was you can't tell a warts and all history of leaders or they're no good as role models. Utter idiots, both of them, obviously not historians or even basically commonsensical. And their point was a reaction to all the intellectual research going on and the building up to what you guys were doing, and basically saying, no, we have to perpetuate a rose tinted view of Joseph Smith and all of our church leaders. We have to be biased and a duty to be biased, unlike historians and journalists, as Dallin Oakes taught. And it must be propaganda. That's the only way. And that stayed in training materials for CES for donkey's years, along with the mantle is greater than the intellect or whatever from Boyd K. Twatty Packer. So that fundamental stupidity means that they then have to kind of lie to everyone. They have to go bend over backwards to stop people finding out that Joseph Smith was human and flawed. And
And
when you
that they're
build up
human and flawed, and that
yes,
they
and
are
that they
human
are
and
as well, yes.
yeah.
But it's an impossible task because we'll
No,
find out
it is
eventually.
impossible.
And when a testimony is that rigid, you only need to find one thing wrong and the whole thing shatters. There's no flexibility or resilience there. That's their fundamental, most basic stupid mistake, and they still haven't learned from it. And they're still trying to cover up everything and bamboozle people. And but by their fruits you shall know them. People are fleeing, and their missionary program has collapsed. They still go on about, oh, we're baptizing loads of people. It's like, yes, but they're nearly all leaving pretty soon afterwards. It's not working. And they never release those retention statistics, which they have. Um, and so the way then, after blowing up this religion, Joseph Smith's credibility, is you can actually still have a church, not just a thousand hopeful, thoughtful individuals who don't know whether what they believe is true or not, which in a sense is the path you're describing yourself on, and lots of other people are as well. My thought is then, is it still possible to have an institution around this stuff? And I think it genuinely is. And then I find the answers for that are all in our own scriptures, because they say everything should be by common consent. No individuals should have ever been given that much power to be corrupted by. There should be the collective wisdom to do the sifting. We vote, we discuss it, and we vote, and we might have to keep changing it as new information arrives. That's the process of education. That's the journey of learning. That's meant to be how Mormons become gods. Not that we follow a covenant path and do the right rituals, not that we get saved by grace in an instant, and we're not really personally involved, both of which are models that
Yeah, that are not right.
proper Mormonism should reject, but that we learn line upon line, precept upon precept, and gradually things become clearer until we're looking in the mirror and our reflection looks more and more like Jesus each time, which means you acknowledge your mistakes and you learn from the mistakes. That's the whole point of coming to Earth. They taught us that in primary, they taught us that in seminary. They don't actually believe it. And discovering that the general authorities of the church ultimately don't actually believe the religion that they're teaching us at grassroots means there is two religions going on at once here. There is the religion that makes sense and is rational and realistic about human fallibility, and the fact that we can redeem people by looking for the best in them, forgiving the worst, but not trying to make excuses for the worst. You shouldn't have to do that, even if the worst is terrible, and leave it to God to do the judging, because he's the only one who understands all the nuance, and whether Joseph Smith knew what he was doing or not, or was in impossible situations. We don't need to worry about that, but we can still make ruthless judgment and say, actually, we're pretty sure that was all a very bad idea. Certainly how those women were treated is utterly unacceptable in any age. There is no ethical morality there of any kind. He may have been tormented and troubled, and probably seen these recent children's comic pages they've come out with to teach them about polygamy. It's like, oh, Joseph Smith had a terrible time. He found it really, really difficult to sexually assault these women and manipulate their families. We don't have to make excuses. And that
Well,
is a
I have to,
superpower,
you know, you,
because then you can look at any religion, any person,
yes,
and choose the good, but still agree on core values. The core values of truth are the same. Be honest. Don't steal. Don't lie. It's in the Ten Commandments.
I have to push
Yeah.
back against, see, I have legal training,
Yeah.
and I have to push back because I have defended people.
Mm.
And I don't know how you can reach the conclusion based on the documents that Joseph Smith sexually assaulted women. I don't see that there's one scrap of evidence that he did that.
Okay, I'll explain what I mean by that. Not
Well,
it would
let me
be
finish
it be in the sense of
my.
statutory rape, that you coerce women into a sexual
There was
situation
no
who are
statute back then.
vulnerable. No, but ethically,
Ethically,
there's a
there's
morality.
no, it's not ethical. It's a change in culture. Let me tell you a story. When I was 11 or 12 years old, I was sitting in the other room while my Aunt Lena, my father's sister, was talking to my mother in the kitchen over a cup of coffee.
Mm.
And my mother said, Lena, you got married at a very early age, didn't you? You married John? Yeah, he was 28 going on 29, and I was 14 going on 15, said my Aunt Lena. And my mother said, well, how did you deal with the, how did you deal with the, my mother it was the 1950s, and my mom was pretty conservative, and she couldn't even say the word sex. But I understood it as an 11-year-old sitting in the next room listening to this conversation. My aunt didn't say the word sex either. She said, oh, that. She said, well, it was worth it to get my own kitchen.
Yeah.
So you don't know what, you see, back then, there was no childhood. Back then, in Brooklyn, New York, when these things were happening, the boys would be growing up and going right into work right after. They didn't even go to school, and they didn't have a chance. They were working all the time, and the girls were working too in sweatshops, and they would get married right away because they wanted to have sex, and they didn't want to have sex out of marriage, so they married early. And the girls often married boys that were older than they were, maybe not by 14 years, but often quite a bit older, because that way they wouldn't have to work, and the guy would work, and they would be supported because somebody had to take care of them when they were pregnant. And I have to tell you that I'm as a lawyer, I'm astonished at the paucity of evidence there is for the fact that, I'm not saying that what Joseph Smith did was right, in the sense of it certainly was maybe unethical. The whole idea of polygamy is appalling to me. I don't like it because it demeans women, because it shows that it takes many women to equal the value of one man, and women are only good insofar as they can produce other males. And it's basically a patriarchal nightmare, and I'm against it and always have been. If I have to ask a question, is why would the Lord even allow this? And the only answer I could come up with ever in my life was, well, polytheism, polygyny, polyandry, and polygamy prevented the church from crawling back into Protestantism because they won't have us. So if it weren't for the polys, we would have wind up like the Community of Christ, essentially being Protestant. And so maybe that was the reason. I can't think of any other reason, because I don't think
but arguably it has stopped us becoming a world religion.
It has stopped us being a world religion, indeed. And so I agree. I don't like it. I don't like the fact that I had to come to the conclusion that the LDS Church has been terribly, terribly corrupted. Its leaders are fascinated by certainty and perfection, and they can't deal with the truth in history or the theology. It is a nightmare. And yet I ask myself, I don't want to judge Joseph Smith because I don't want to be judged the way other people are judging him. I don't want, I take seriously Jesus' statement about judge not lest you be judged with the same judgment that you judge with. I don't have enough information. It may be.
That shouldn't then mean carte blanche for anything, though, that we never apply ethics at all to situations or learn from their mistakes. I think we can all agree those were mistakes. But I would just push back slightly on part of how you framed that. Yes, in New York in the early 1800s, everyone was marrying young. It was a hard life. It's brutal, and no one had decent sex education. But there was a social norm that you're not polygamous. And I
Yes,
think that is a
absolutely.
huge difference. In that sense, Joseph Smith was coercing vulnerable young women into adultery, to betray their husbands they're already married to. Even if it wasn't a sexual marriage, that's still a betrayal. They're not there. They're off on a mission, and Joseph Smith goes for them. He went for a foster daughter that he sent their father on a mission, had them living in his home, and then maneuvered into a marriage and probably sexual relationship with that young woman. It all feels very predatory. It looks predatory. It smells predatory. It is predatory. And he didn't need to do that to fulfill some kind of concept of plural marriage. He was marrying people he couldn't have children with, when allegedly the point of it was to have children. But he was forcing these young people, particularly the younger ones, into a situation that was totally socially unacceptable, whereas the marriages you've described were the social norm. So they're not the same thing. That is not an equivalence, and they had to keep it secret. And they have written their feelings about it. You know, some of the writings, I think Helena Kimball and others, where they wrote what it felt like to have that happen. It was devastating for them. The harm that there's no doubt about that. So I would urge you to sort of nuance up a little bit in that direction, that we have very clear, written, credible historical records from those women's voices themselves. And if only to prevent Maven coming round your house and beating you up, I need to speak, because she will not be happy bunny with you right now, because she does not like it when people ignore the women's voices and it all becomes these men talking about the highfalutin sort of
Well,
doctrinal big historical picture. Um,
I've
those
looked
women
at
were suffering and they said so. And also all the records of the wives of Brigham Young and other people later who suffered in polygamy, you know, it scaled up. You know, the most of the women who were polygamous were not being married to Joseph Smith. They were in a machine of sex trafficking where, you know, our country here was harvested for young women, told that polygamy was absolutely not happening in Utah, that this was an anti-Mormon lie. And then as soon as they get there out into the wilderness with no power or money or independence, they're married off to dirty old men as their next bride, who are squabbling over them if they're beautiful as property. That is the fruit of all of this. And some of it was already happening among Joseph Smith's own
Well, I
wife.
have never been able
So
to defend polygamy.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
agree with what you say. It was
yeah,
illegal. It put
yeah.
people in a situation where they're trapped
They're in danger.
in
Yeah.
an illegal practice that made them
Mm,
basically criminals.
mm,
They had to escape to the west, to Mexico, really.
yeah. Mm,
Initially, Utah was Mexico. I'm trying to get out
mm.
of the light that's coming through my window
Oh,
and creating a dappled
right.
effect on my face.
Yes, right.
But in any case, that you're right. You're absolutely right.
Mm,
I've argued the same thing. Uh,
mm,
I don't think that the statements of the women who later were interviewed were uniformly uh,
mm,
against Joseph. I think
mm.
that they
Yeah,
expressed that they
that's
had
fair.
suffered terribly.
Yeah.
The men
Mm,
suffered, the children suffered. There was no doubt
mm,
that
mm,
polygamy brought huge amounts of suffering on people.
mm,
Uh,
mm,
I think that the way it was introduced, was, like you say, it was unethical. It was all of this. At the same time, I don't know what was in their minds. I mean,
mm,
certainly you want to dismiss it all. Well, this is what a con man does. No, this is not what a con man does. A con man doesn't justify having sex with a bunch of women by creating a religion that allows him to marry them. If you wanted sex on the frontier, it was available to you in America. Everybody was having sex on the frontier.
mm,
I'm surprised that people weren't tripping over each other having sex on the frontier. Why would you establish some kind of polygamous thing? What were you trying to
mm,
convince them of? The women were certainly
mm,
willing to have sex with Joseph Smith, whether he was a prophet or not.
mm,
So what was going on here?
mm.
And why would you write a
Oh, yeah.
book, the Book of Mormon, that condemns polygamy and then bring it
Mm,
in?
mm,
And then why would you break down a press contrary to, get yourself in trouble on the First Amendment grounds, and
mm,
while you're in Nauvoo, and the expositor break up the printing press and get yourself into deep trouble that leads eventually to your own murder?
mm. I
Why
think,
would you go back
yeah.
when you were
Mm,
escaping, and why were you go back to
mm.
face the mob? Why?
It's
How
all
would you be?
fascinating, isn't it?
I mean,
The
this
painful
is so
uncertainty of it all.
this is so
Damn it.
confusing.
It
I've read
is.
so much history and so much theology.
Yeah.
I'm at the end of my life and at the end of my wits, because I ask myself,
Mm,
what
yeah.
is this? But then I look at
Mm,
I look at the Old Testament, I look at other sacred texts that purport to have history in them and legend, and they're all riddled. It's always a pockmarked, it's a checkered, and I come to your conclusion. I try to take the good out of it.
mm,
And what
yeah.
is the good? I believe in
Mm,
forgiveness. I believe in redemption. I believe ultimately in life over death. I believe that we are in a pickle I believe that I enter this life in the middle of things. I exit in middle of things. I will soon exit in the middle of things. There will be no resolution. And I'm full of uncertainty and a certain amount of fear because I don't know what's going to happen. And yes, I can understand that Maven would like to come over and hit me on the head with a
No, I
brickbat.
think you've redeemed yourself now. I think you're safe again. We should announce in internet we'll Paul Toscano safe from being hit by a brickbat by Maven. So you've got yourself out that hole. Well done. I just wanted to do that for as health and safety. So I think we can conclude this one then, which is what I said it's going to be controversial. It's a fascinating topic, Is Joseph Smith good or evil? And in a
People are
sense,
going
we
to
both
have to sort
agree.
that out for
Yeah, he's
themselves.
both. But ultimately, how we conceptualize our personal religion and as our church,
Exactly.
and which was meant to be the saving grace of Mormonism, of ongoing revelation and learning from our mistakes, not covering them up, not lying about them, learn from them. That's the point. And the church taught us that, Mormonism taught us that as a foundational core principle. It's I don't know, some lovely language from the New Testament you hear in Anglican ceremonies sometimes, this idea of a constantly new creation, something along those lines, that we're meant to be reforming our religion every day as we learn more and get better.
Yeah, it is.
And institutionally and personally, but you can only do that if you're going to be honest about the past and willing to learn from the mistakes, or you endlessly repeat them. That's history 101. People who don't learn from history or aren't told the true history can never learn from it, and they will repeat it in all its glory and mistakes. But there is enough there once you have that, and just sort of that Second Nephi 29, I think it is, my favorite scripture, which talks about how God has spoken to the Israelites and the scattered Nephites and the Israelites everywhere and all the other nations of the earth.
Yeah.
And that one verse, which is in my celebration of Mormon scriptures I love, that I know you've listened to, I think opens up unbelievable possibilities, because it's saying to us, God has spoken to every civilization, every culture, every religion,
Right.
every author. So get out there and sift.
Right. Sift.
Hold, to prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. And if we allow ourselves to do that, we can have a mature, thriving, successful, relevant, hopeful, unified, joyful religion. And politically, that happens through democracy. It's the only way, and freedom of expression and inquiry. And those same principles have to be there in the church, or it will die. And we're seeing it die because it stubbornly refuses still to do those really basic things with enthusiasm. They're always dragged half-hearted into little concessions, but it's never fast enough, and it always costs too much. So, Joseph Smith, take your pick.
That's right. I have daughters and a granddaughter. I'm not in favor of polygamy.
No, you wouldn't let Joseph Smith in the house. I mean, that's always a good question, and I know people who've asked their bishops and stake presidents this. If you were living back then, would you let Joseph Smith alone in a room with your daughter? And they almost universally say no, absolutely not. Or
Yeah,
they say, because they're pious, they'll say, well, I'd have to pray about it.
I'd have
Oh
to
my
pray
gosh.
about it.
And you can imagine what their daughters think listening into that conversation. It's like, oh, Dad would kill us all if he thought God told him to.
Let's move on to chapel
Sure.
priesthoods.